Every single one of us grew up with the same image: a weathered piece of parchment, edges burned or torn, stained with seawater and age, a coastline drawn in faded ink, a dotted line winding through mountains and jungle, and at the end of that line, drawn in the same careful hand that mapped the route, a large black X. The treasure is here. Dig here. Everything you are looking for is exactly here. It is one of the most persistent images in Western culture. It appears in children's books, in blockbuster films, in theme park rides, in video games, in the visual language of adventure itself. The pirate treasure map is so deeply embedded in how we imagine the past that most people have never stopped to ask the most basic question about it. Did it actually exist? Not in the abstract sense. Not as a concept, as a real object. Did pirates? The actual historical sailors who terrorized merchant shipping in the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean between roughly 1650 and 1730 actually bury treasure, draw maps to its location, and leave those maps to be found by future generations of enterprising adventurers? The answer is almost certainly no. And the story of how this lie became one of the most durable myths in popular culture is considerably more interesting than the myth itself. It involves a single novel published in 1883, a Scottish writer who borrowed imagery from a defunct American genre, a publishing industry that found a formula and never let it go, and the specific psychological needs of an industrializing society that had lost its frontier and desperately needed to invent a new one. But before we get to the lie, let us spend time with the truth. Because the actual history of piracy is remarkable enough that it does not need embellishment. And understanding what pirates actually were, what they actually did with their money, and how they actually operated makes the treasure map mythology not just false, but almost comically implausible. The golden age of piracy, the period that provides virtually all of the cultural raw material for our modern pirate mythology, ran from approximately 1650 to 1730. The pirates of this era operated primarily in three theaters: the Caribbean, the waters around West Africa, and the slave trade routes, and the Indian Ocean, particularly the Red Sea, and the approaches to the Arabian Peninsula, where the incredibly wealthy Muslim pilgrimage shipping provided spectacular targets. The men who sailed these routes, figures like Edward Teach, Samuel Bellamy, Bartholomew Roberts, Henry Avery, and Charles Vane, were not the romantic outlaws of popular imagination. They were desperate, violent, frequently drunk men living lives of extraordinary physical hardship with very short average life expectancies. The romanticism was added later by people who were not there. The economics of piracy are essential to understanding why treasure maps make no sense. Piracy was not a career that generated the kind of wealth the mythology suggests. The vast majority of pirates never accumulated significant fortunes. A successful prize capture might yield a share worth a few months of a working man's wages. Exceptional captures were rarer than the legend implies, and their proceeds were distributed and spent quickly. The share system that governed pirate vessels divided prize money among the crew after each successful capture, meaning that whatever value a ship carried was split up and spent, usually extremely quickly, at the nearest port where a pirate crew could find entertainment, alcohol, and the company of people willing to take their money. Port Royal in Jamaica before the 1692 earthquake, Nassau in the Bahamas during the Pirate Republic period, and Libertalia in Madagascar. If the legendary settlement actually existed, these were places where pirate wealth went to disappear into taverns and gambling dens and the hands of merchants who charged pirate prices precisely because their customers had nowhere else to spend. The idea that a pirate would accumulate enough wealth to make burying it worthwhile, and then go to the trouble of burying it in a remote location rather than spending it, and then create a precise cartographic document marking the burial site, and then keep that document safe through the rigors of life at sea, represents a misunderstanding of pirate economics so complete that it is almost a different subject entirely. There are a handful of documented cases of pirates burying treasure, and they are instructive precisely because of how atypical they were. William Kidd, the Scottish privateer turned pirate who was hanged in London in 1701, did reportedly bury a cache of valuables on Gardiner's Island off the coast of Long Island before sailing to Boston to attempt to negotiate his freedom. The cache was recovered by colonial authorities almost immediately after it was buried and used as evidence against him at trial. And the story of Kidd's buried treasure persisted for centuries afterward and generated an enormous amount of speculative treasure hunting along the eastern American seaboard. But the actual historical episode, a man making a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to use physical assets as a bargaining chip in a legal negotiation, is about as far from romance as it is possible to get. Henry Avery, whose capture of the Ganges Sawai in 1695 remains one of the most lucrative acts of piracy in recorded history, reportedly walked away with a personal share of loot worth the equivalent of several million modern dollars. He vanished from the historical record shortly afterward, probably into obscurity in Ireland or the English provinces. And his treasure was never found because he almost certainly spent it over the course of a quiet retirement rather than burying it under a palm tree. The legend that grew up around Avery's missing fortune is genuine. The treasure map that supposedly led to it is not. Samuel Bellamy, known as Black Sam Bellamy, captured more than 50 ships in a career that lasted less than 2 years before his flagship, the Whydah, sank in a storm off Cape Cod in 1717, killing him and most of his crew. The Whydah, recovered by underwater archaeologists beginning in 1984, contained artifacts that told the real story of what pirates accumulated. Coins from a dozen different nations, personal effects from captured crewmen, weapons, and trade goods. No map, no buried cache. A sunken ship full of the miscellaneous debris of a violent and chaotic career. Or Bartholomew Roberts, who captured more than 400 ships between 1719 and 1722 and was by any reasonable measure the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, was killed in combat off the coast of West Africa. His crew was captured, and most of them were hanged. The prize money that Roberts had accumulated over his career was distributed among his crew through the share system as it was earned. There was no buried fortune, there was no map. There was a man who was very good at his violent profession for a few years and then died violently in it, which was how most pirate careers ended. So where did the map come from? The answer is a children's novel, and the story of how that novel came to be is one of the more fascinating episodes in literary history. Robert Louis Stevenson published Treasure Island in book form in 1883, although it had appeared in serialized form in a magazine called Young Folks from 1881 to 1882 under the title The Sea Cook. Stevenson was 30 years old, living in Scotland, suffering from the tuberculosis that would eventually kill him, and casting around for a story that would capture a young reader's imagination. The origin story that Stevenson told repeatedly in later life was that the novel grew out of a map he drew to entertain his 12-year-old stepson Lloyd Osborne during a rainy Scottish summer. He drew a detailed map of a fictional island, labeled it, included the locations of a buried treasure, and then found that the map was so evocative that it generated a story almost automatically. The characters, he said, simply arrived to fill the landscape the map implied. This origin story is almost too perfect to be entirely true, and there is reason to believe that Stevenson, who was an extraordinarily self-conscious literary craftsman, shaped his account of the novel's genesis to emphasize the organic, almost accidental quality of its creation. But whatever the precise truth of how the novel began, what is clear is that Stevenson drew very extensively on existing literary sources in developing it. The most important of these was Washington Irving, the American writer whose 1824 story about Captain Kidd had established many of the tropes that Stevenson would crystallize. Irving's stories about buried pirate gold in the Hudson Valley and along the New England coast were enormously popular in early 19th century America and created a substantial amateur treasure hunting culture that persisted for generations. P. Stevenson essentially took an American folkloric tradition, filtered it through his own extraordinary gift for narrative, and produced a version so compelling and so complete that it became the definitive text on the subject for the entire English-speaking world. The map in Treasure Island is not incidental to the novel. It is constitutive. Stevenson published it as a frontispiece, a beautifully detailed illustration of the fictional island with depth soundings, compass rose, topographic features, and the 3 crosses marking the treasure location drawn in a different hand from the map's primary cartography, suggesting that they were added later by the pirate Flint himself. The map made the novel's world feel real in a way that pure prose could not have achieved. It also established, in the minds of millions of readers, the visual language of pirate treasure in a form that has never been successfully dislodged. The publishing industry recognized immediately that Stevenson had found something extraordinarily commercially durable. The combination of adventure, moral ambiguity, buried treasure, and the visual anchor of the map was a formula that could be replicated endlessly. The decades following Treasure Island saw a flood of pirate adventure fiction, all drawing on the conventions that Stevenson had established, all featuring treasure maps as central plot devices, all deepening the cultural groove that made the image feel like historical truth rather than literary invention. J.M. Barrie borrowed from Stevenson for Peter Pan, published in 1904, giving Captain Hook a backstory that explicitly connected him to the Treasure Island tradition. Howard Pyle, the American illustrator and writer who produced the most influential visual representations of pirates in the early 20th century, drew on Stevenson's conventions extensively. His illustrations, published in Harper's Monthly magazine in the 1880s and 1890s, established the visual template for pirate iconography that Hollywood would later inherit. By the time the film industry began adapting pirate stories in the silent era, the treasure map was so fundamental to the genre that questioning its historical basis would have seemed as perverse as questioning whether the Earth was round. But the myth of the treasure map did not just shape popular fiction. It shaped actual behavior in the physical world in ways that are genuinely remarkable and, in many cases, genuinely tragic. The Oak Island mystery in Nova Scotia is the most extensively documented and most expensive example of treasure map mythology operating in the real world. The island became associated with buried treasure in the late 18th century, when local accounts began circulating about a depression in the ground that suggested an artificial pit. Over the following 2 centuries, successive groups of investors poured increasingly large sums of money into excavation projects, convinced that some enormous treasure, variously attributed to Captain Kidd, to Francis Drake, to the Knights Templar, to Shakespeare's missing manuscripts, and to dozens of other sources, lay at the bottom of what became known as the Money Pit. The total amount of money spent on Oak Island treasure hunting over roughly 200 years runs into the tens of millions of dollars. Several people have died in excavation accidents. The physical island has been so thoroughly disrupted by digging that genuine archaeological investigation of its history has become nearly impossible. No significant treasure has ever been found. The geological and archaeological consensus is that the so-called Money Pit is most likely a naturally occurring phenomenon, a karst sinkhole or a collapsed sea cave, whose artificial appearance generated a feedback loop of wishful interpretation that became essentially self-perpetuating once enough money had been invested to create its own institutional momentum. The Cocos Island treasure story is another case study in the real-world consequences of treasure map mythology. The island, located in the Pacific Ocean about 300 miles off the coast of Costa Rica, has attracted treasure hunters since at least the early 19th century on the basis of stories about vast quantities of gold supposedly hidden there during the South American independence wars of the 1820s. The treasure, known as the Lima treasure, was supposedly loaded onto a British merchant vessel for safekeeping during the chaos of the period, and was then buried on Cocos Island when the crew apparently decided to keep it rather than return it to its rightful owners. The Lima treasure story has generated dozens of serious expeditions and hundreds of casual ones over the past 2 centuries. Costa Rica has had to establish legal frameworks specifically to control treasure hunting on the island, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, partly because the marine ecosystems around it are among the most pristine in the Pacific, and partly because the treasure hunting history has made it a continuing target for unauthorized excavation. No treasure has ever been found, which is not surprising given that the historical documentation for the Lima treasure story is, on careful examination, almost entirely composed of layers of hearsay and wishful interpolation built up over generations. What these cases share is a specific psychological dynamic that the treasure map mythology both reflects and exploits. The map implies that the world contains hidden reserves of value accessible to the person with the right information and the courage to act on it. It promises that effort and adventure will be rewarded with sudden, dramatic, life-changing wealth. It situates that promise in a specific place, making it feel tangible and achievable rather than merely aspirational. And it provides a narrative framework, the quest, the obstacles, the moment of discovery, that organizes the hope into something that feels like a plan. This is a fantasy structure, not a historical one. And its appeal is not historical either. It is psychological and economic. The golden age of piracy coincided with the early development of European capitalism. The treasure map mythology reached its mature form in the 1880s, precisely when industrial capitalism had eliminated most of the frontier opportunities that earlier generations had used to organize similar fantasies of sudden wealth. The California gold rush of 1849 was real. The Klondike gold rush of 1896 was real. But both were over by the time Stevenson's novel was generating its cultural aftershocks, and the symbolic space they had occupied in the popular imagination needed to be filled by something. The pirate treasure map, with its promise of buried wealth waiting to be discovered by the clever and the brave, fit that space with almost uncanny precision. The relationship between treasure map mythology and actual economic conditions is not accidental. In periods of economic insecurity, interest in buried treasure stories reliably increases. The Depression era of the 1930s saw a significant spike in published pirate adventure fiction and in amateur treasure hunting activity. The economic disruptions of the 1970s and 1980s coincided with a renewed popular interest in treasure hunting of all kinds. The Internet era, which has simultaneously made vast amounts of historical information available and created new communities of enthusiastic amateur researchers, has produced an extraordinary proliferation of treasure hunting content, from dedicated YouTube channels to reality television series like The Curse of Oak Island, which has been running for over a decade and has attracted millions of viewers through the consistent application of a narrative formula that Stevenson would have recognized immediately. The show's genius, if genius is the right word, and is that it takes the treasure map structure and applies it to the pace of modern television. Each episode promises revelation and defers it. The map, in the show's logic, is replaced by an accumulating archive of tantalizing near discoveries, expert consultants who confirm that something significant is almost certainly down there, and the emotional investment of the Lagina brothers, whose combination of genuine enthusiasm and strategic disappointment provides the effective engine that keeps viewers watching season after season. The production team understands instinctively what Stevenson understood intellectually. The promise of treasure is more commercially durable than the discovery of it. Once you find the chest, the story is over. As long as you are searching, the story never has to end. The treasure has never been found because the treasure is not the point. The search is the point. The map is the point. The promise is the point. Stevenson understood this. He was a better writer than most of his imitators and a more honest one. Treasure Island is not actually a story about finding treasure. It is a story about desire, about the moral corruption that the desire for unearned wealth produces, about the way that adults fail children, and children are forced to navigate a world of adult betrayal and violence. The treasure, when it is finally found, is strangely anticlimactic. The real dramatic weight of the novel falls on the characters, on the relationships, on the moral education of young Jim Hawkins. Long John Silver, not the treasure chest, is what people remember. But the culture that consumed Treasure Island took from it what it needed, which was the map and the promise, and left behind the moral complexity that made Stevenson's version of the story genuinely literary. The pirate treasure map as a cultural object is Treasure Island, with the irony removed, the ambiguity flattened, and the promise made unconditional. The actual pirates of the Golden Age left very different legacies than buried treasure. They left behind, in many cases, remarkably democratic organizational structures. Pirate articles, the contracts that governed life aboard pirate vessels, frequently included provisions for disability compensation, democratic voting on major decisions, and limitations on the authority of the captain that made some pirate ships considerably more egalitarian than the merchant and naval vessels from which their crews had often fled. A pirate captain who made decisions the crew disagreed with could be voted out. The quartermaster, elected separately from the captain, held authority over the distribution of prizes and acted as a check on the captain's power in matters not directly related to combat. This was genuinely radical governance for the early 18th century. Historians like Marcus Rediker have argued convincingly that the Golden Age pirates represented a genuine counterculture, a rejection of the brutal hierarchies of merchant shipping and naval service in favor of something that, however violent and criminal it also was, incorporated real principles of collective self-governance. This is a far more interesting legacy than buried treasure, and it is historically real. The pirates did not leave maps. They left a model of organization that influenced radical political thought in ways that are still being traced by historians. They left court records that document, in their own words, why men chose piracy and what they hoped to get from it. They left a body of popular legend that their contemporaries who knew the reality of piracy firsthand found considerably less romantic than we do. And they left a historical record that is rich enough and complicated enough that it does not need the overlay of a Scottish novelist's imagination to make it worth studying. The treasure map is a lie, but it is a lie that tells us something true, not about pirates, but about us, about what we want to believe the world contains, about the psychological comfort of thinking that somewhere under a specific patch of ground, marked with a specific symbol on a specific piece of paper, there is a chest full of gold waiting for the right person to claim it. About the human need for the world to contain hidden reserves of possibility that ordinary life and ordinary economics have not yet reached and cannot foreclose. Stevenson understood that need. He drew a map for a rainy afternoon, and it became one of the most powerful images of the modern era. Not because it was true, because it was exactly what people needed to believe. The pirates are long dead. The treasure maps they never drew have been redrawn thousands of times by writers, filmmakers, game designers, and television producers who have found in that single fictional image an inexhaustible source of the one commodity that never loses its value. Hope that the world is more interesting than it appears, and that somewhere just beneath the surface, the real adventure is waiting to begin. If this gave you a different way of thinking about one of history's most persistent myths and what it actually reveals about us, subscribe and turn on notifications. We dig into the real history behind the stories that shaped how we see the world every week. Drop a comment with what you want us to investigate next. The truth is almost always more interesting than the legend.